Okay, I'm gonna. Okay, so instead of doing an exegesis of 14 chapters of Hosea, um, I'm going to take a little bit different approach and kind of focus on what I think is the a theme, the theme of the book, and trace that through the book. I think that one of the key verses is Hosea 4:6, which says, "My people are destroyed for lack of knowledge." Uh, that might be one of the more misquoted verses in the Bible. I've heard health people talking, giving a seminar and saying, make their thing sound Christian, and they'll quote that verse. But this verse is not about knowledge of red light therapy or fenbendazole. It's about knowing God. Okay. And it's not just knowing about God, but knowing him personally and intimately. And so that's the theme I want to kind of follow as we're looking at the book. And the Net Bible always seems to translate it, acknowledge God. And I don't really care for that as much. It seems too cerebral. Okay. And so, if we're having an argument and I say, well, you acknowledge that I'm right or that my logic is right, and you would say, well, okay, but you're not really feeling it in your heart and you haven't really been convinced. And so it's like that old saying, a man convinced against his will is of the same opinion still. Okay. So anyway, that's where we're headed with Hosea. The historical setting, Hosea wrote to the northern tribe. You can see that, wrote to Israel. This is in the 8th century. Assyria is the main threat. And so Assyria eventually will take over Israel in 722 BC. And so the first verse says, "This is the Lord's message that came to Hosea, son of Beeri, during the time of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah, and during the time of Jeroboam, son of Joash, king of Israel." Okay, so about all we know about Hosea is that he's son of Beeri. Okay, and then he gives us a list of these kings. And the kings on the left in the blue are the southern kingdom. Kings on the right are the northern kingdom. And he mentioned Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, which were the southern kingdom kings. And he mentions Jeroboam on the right. Now there's two Jeroboams. There's one at the top, Jeroboam the first, and then about 2/3 of the way down across from Hezekiah is Jeroboam the second. And so you'll see Jeroboam, son of Nebat, sometimes in Jeroboam, son of Joash, or Jehoash. There's different spellings for the same guy. Okay. What I find interesting is he doesn't mention Zechariah, Shallum, Menachem, Pekahiah, Pekah, and Hosea. Those 6 kings followed Jeroboam. And he ministered during the reign of those kings too. So I wonder why he left them out. Maybe because they didn't amount to much. Some of them only lasted a few weeks before they were assassinated. But I think probably he's focusing on Jeroboam. And when you go and you read about Jeroboam the second, it says, in the 15th year of the reign of Judah's king Amaziah, son of Joash, Jeroboam, son of Joash, became king over Israel. He reigned for 41 years in Samaria. He did evil in the sight of the Lord. He did not repudiate the sinful ways of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, who encouraged Israel to sin. So those 6 kings that followed Jeroboam, it says the same thing about them. They did not repudiate the sinful ways of Jeroboam. And if you search for that, did not repudiate the ways of Jeroboam, I found 25 places in 1st and 2nd Kings where it says that. So what's one of the things that tells us something's important? Repetition, right? So what is the um, terrible sin that Jeroboam committed? So context. After Solomon dies, Rehoboam, his son, takes over. And the people come to Rehoboam and say, the taxes are too high. You're killing us. Can you lower the taxes, right? And he says ask the advisors of his father, the older, wiser men, what should I do? And they said, oh yeah, your father was too harsh. It would be great for you to relieve some of the burden on the people. And then he asked his friends, his age, what do you think? And they go, oh, you should be harsher. And so he comes back out, tells the people, uh, I'm not only going to, I'm going to double down. I'm going to be even harder than my father. Okay. And so Jeroboam goes and sets up a new kingdom, and 10 tribes follow him. And that's how we get the divided kingdom. Jeroboam, Israel in the north, Judah in the south. Okay. So it says in 1 Kings 12:25-29, Jeroboam built up Shechem in the Ephraimite hill country and lived there. From there he went out and built up Penuel. Jeroboam then thought to himself, now the Davidic dynasty could regain the kingdom. If these people go up to offer sacrifices in the Lord's temple in Jerusalem, their loyalty could shift to their former master, King Rehoboam of Judah. They might kill me and return to King Rehoboam of Judah. After the king had consulted with his advisors, he made 2 golden calves. And then he said to the people, it is too much trouble for you to go up to Jerusalem. Look, Israel, here are your gods who brought you up from the land of Egypt. He put one in Bethel and the other in Dan. This caused Israel to sin. The people went to Bethel and Dan to worship the calves. It's hard to believe that they believed that. That was the God who delivered them out of Egypt. So Jeroboam realized that if the people went back to Jerusalem and worshiped the true God, then they might get to know God and they might want to obey God, and then they might want to reunite the kingdom. But his agenda was, I want to be king. He liked the power and the prestige. Okay. So I think he's putting his own desire and his own will above the will of God. And he recognized that he needed to change God into something else. And so he sets up the golden calves. Okay. And so if Dan is at the very north of Israel, and Bethel is like one of the last cities on the road to Judah and Jerusalem. And so they would stop at Bethel and worship the golden calf and not go all the way down to Jerusalem. And one of the reasons I wanted to talk about Jeroboam and Bethel and Dan is when you read through the book of Hosea, quite often he will condemn Beth Aven. Okay. Bethel, what does Bethel mean? House of God, Beth El. Okay. Beth Aven means house of sin. Okay. House of wickedness. Okay. And so whenever you see Beth Aven in Hosea, he's not talking about Beth Aven. That was a little town a little east of Bethel. Okay. He's talking about Bethel. And so like if, for instance, in Hosea 10:5, he says, the inhabitants of Samaria will lament over the calf idol of Beth Aven. Was there a calf idol in Beth Aven? No, it was in Bethel. And so that's just his sarcastic name, perhaps, for Bethel all through the book. So it said there in verse 30, this caused Israel to sin, so that is the sin of Jeroboam, is setting up the golden calf worship. And so does this have application for us? I think that if we evaluate what's going on with him, he wanted to live independently from God. Okay. He put himself and his own desires before God, and he had his strategies about how he was going to bring that about. And that depended on basically developing a distorted view of God. Okay. And so I think he avoided getting to know God because that would have changed his opinion, his actions. Okay. So the principle perhaps is encountering God as he is it invariably changes our personal agendas, our goals, or objectives. Okay. And if he truly had a heart for God and had really sought to worship God, then he would have seen God's glory and his own sinfulness, and that would have driven him to want to do God's will. And so I think he probably never encountered God when he was doing his obligatory worship in Jerusalem, his whole life. And so, Isaiah 6, he saw the glory of God and said, woe is me, I am a man of unclean lips. And God says, who can I send? And he says, send me. Okay, so that is an example of how it's supposed to work. And then 2 Kings 17, 18 through 23, towards the end of 2 Kings. So the Lord was furious with Israel and rejected them. Only the tribe of Judah was left. Judah also failed to keep the commandments of the Lord their God. They followed Israel's example, so the Lord rejected all of Israel's descendants. He humiliated them and handed them over to the robbers until he had thrown them from his presence. He tore Israel away from David's dynasty, and Jeroboam, son of Nebat, became their king. Jeroboam drove Israel away from the Lord and encouraged them to commit a serious sin. The Israelites followed in the sinful ways of Jeroboam and did not repudiate them. Finally, the Lord rejected Israel, just as he had warned he would do through all his servants, the prophets. Israel was deported from its land to Assyria and remains there to this very day. So he basically took the whole nation down with him. So I think the story of Jeroboam reinforces the theme of knowing God, and he went out of his way to avoid that happening. Okay. Any thoughts? Any questions? Okay. Here's my chart outline of Hosea. The first 3 chapters are about Hosea's marriage, and that marriage is a picture of God's marriage to Israel. And so what he asked Hosea to do is supposed to illustrate God's love and the relationship with Israel. And then we go through 11 chapters of a series of sermons or messages where there's a listing of Israel's sin, there's a pronouncement of God's judgment, a call to repentance, and a promise of restoration. And so we're going to skim through those chapters and look at various places, but not every one of them. And then at the end, chapter 14 is the ultimate restoration. So Hosea 1:2 says, go take for yourself a wife of whoredom and have children of whoredom, for the land commits great whoredom by forsaking the Lord. That's ESV. And that, go marry a prostitute who will bear illegitimate children, conceived through prostitution, because the nation continually commits spiritual prostitution by turning away from the Lord. And the NIV says, go marry a promiscuous woman and have children with her, for like an adulterous wife, this land is guilty of unfaithfulness to the Lord. So right off the bat, there's some debate about Gomer. Was she a prostitute when he married her, or just promiscuous? And it's hard to know. You can see the different translations have different interpretive opinions. Okay. It could be that just like God knew Israel would be unfaithful, he's telling Hosea that your wife will become unfaithful. And it wasn't necessarily her status at the beginning of the marriage.
Isn't the NIV different? It's actually, it says have children with her.
Yeah.
Which doesn't mean that they would be illegitimate.
That's the next problem. I'm going to get to that in just a second. But you're very observant. That's good. Bob Chisholm, who's a prof at Dallas Seminary, and I took Hebrew from him, said since Gomer's activity symbolizes Israel's covenantal unfaithfulness, and since the Hebrew word translated adulteress is used elsewhere in the book for the unfaithfulness of God's wife, Israel, it's probable that the phrase adulterous wife refers to Gomer's marital infidelity rather than premarital experiences. In that case, knowledge of her status at the time of the marriage is precluded. And then the Net Bible has a footnote on that. It says, wife or woman of harlotries. The noun zunim means fornication. The term does not refer to mere adultery. Which that's a quote James changed in the Net Bible footnotes to NIV 84 because they used to call her a wife of adultery. And they changed that in 2011 to just promiscuous woman, which is expressed by the root na'af, adultery. The proper noun zunim, literally harlotries, is an example of the plural character or plural of repeated behavior. The phrase wife of harlotries probably refers to a woman who is a prostitute, possibly a temple prostitute serving at the Baal temple. So maybe she's working in Bethel, okay? So we don't know, but you can see that the translations are divided on her status at the point of marriage. And then people talk about, well, there's an analogy between his marriage and God's marriage to Israel. And was Israel a prostitute before God married her, later gave the Mosaic covenant? Well, if you go back to Exodus 19 through 34, while Moses is up on the mountain getting the prenuptial, they're down making golden calves or golden calf, right? Mm-hmm. So one can argue both ways. Oh, and to your point, there's also a question about, are these children Hosea's? The first one obviously is, but the second two, it doesn't say that they are illegitimate or it's kind of vague in the Hebrew. And so we can see that the Net Bible calls them illegitimate children. Okay. I'm not really sure of the way that the ESV is worded. It kind of leaves it maybe open-ended. But the NIV is definitely thinking that they're Hosea's. Okay. So again, it's a division.
I mean, is there even like tension of the theological question of, is God asking him to break the law in some sense? Is he even breaking any laws?
Well, that's a good question. Perhaps. I mean, there's a law that says if you get divorced, you're not supposed to remarry the same person. And God does that with Israel. And we'll see that, in this book. So yeah, that's a good question. I don't know the answer. Hosea 1, 3 through 5. So Hosea married Gomer, the daughter of Diblaim, and then she conceived and gave birth to a son for him. And then the Lord said to Hosea, name him Jezreel, because in a little while I will punish the dynasty of Jehu on account of the bloodshed in the valley of Jezreel. And I will put an end to the kingdom of Israel. At that time, I will destroy the military power of Israel in the valley of Jezreel. So the word Jezreel means God scatters. And so there's probably some play on words going on here because God's going to take over Israel. Syria is going to take over Israel and scatter them to the world. Also, the word means to sow. So we will see that meaning used later. But the Jezreel is also a town and a valley. And so he's referring to what happened at Jezreel. What did Jehu do that was so bad at Jezreel? If you go back and read in the books of 1st and 2nd Kings, you read about Jezebel and Ahab, right? And Elijah prophesied against them, and that was Mount Carmel. And Elijah prophesied that Ahab and his descendants would be taken out. Elisha commanded that it be done. And then the Lord commended Jehu for doing it in 2 Kings 10:30. And so some argue, how can he commend Jehu for doing what he asked, and then over here say he's going to punish him for what happened? Well, if you go back and read the story, he didn't just kill Ahab and his descendants. He killed Ahaziah, king of Judah, 42 of Ahaziah's relatives, and he killed some more Baal functionaries, which that was okay, but the attack on the house of David went too far. And so that, I think, is what's going on there. And then when you read the story of Jehu and you get to the very last sentence about him, what does it say? He continued in the ways of Jeroboam. Okay, he did not repudiate his sins. And so he kept the golden calf worship, probably for the same motivation that Jeroboam did it. And so I think if you look at these historical events and kind of analyze what's going on with Jeroboam and Jehu, I think that, they had their own agenda of being in power, and they distorted their view of God so that they would not have to have an encounter with God and be convicted and change and give up power. And so I guess I personally would say, what are our personal application be? What are our own agendas when we come to church? Are we thinking about business deals elsewhere? Are we thinking about business deals here at the church? Or are we paying attention and worshiping, or are we distracted? And, I know realtors, insurance salesmen, they can be going to church because that's a good place to earn people's trust and get business. I can remember going to a very rich church a few years ago when our kids were in choir practice, and a person had given a large donation to Bible.org. And I remember thinking, I wonder if I went to church here, I could get more donations. Yeah. And so we have these other thoughts. And so that would be an application, I think. And then I guess the other one I would say is, do we distort our concept of God to promote our selfish agenda? And so you could have a God, you might focus on his love and have a grandfather image of God, who, the grandparents spoil the grandchild. They don't discipline the grandchild. So if you're thinking of God that way, or you have a prosperity gospel version of God, where God's more of a genie that you pray to or proclaim the words, and he helps meet your needs. So it doesn't just have to be a golden calf. It could be, some other concept. Thoughts, questions? Okay. Well, I already did that. Hosea 1:6-7. She conceived again and gave birth to a daughter. And then the Lord said to him, name her No Pity, Lo Ruhamah, because I will no longer have pity on the nation of Israel. For I will certainly not forgive their guilt, but I will have pity on the nation of Judah. I will deliver them by the Lord their God. I will not deliver them by the warrior's bow, by sword, by military victory, by chariot horses, or by chariots. So that's pretty clear. God's not going to have compassion on Israel any longer. It's time for judgment, right? But he also talks about Judah, okay? Judah's not as bad yet. So he's going to have pity on Judah still. It says he's not going to deliver them by military might. Does anybody remember how it happened? After Syria defeated Israel, they headed south and they started taking out all the cities on the way to Jerusalem. And then they surround Jerusalem. And Hezekiah prays. And that night, 185,000 Assyrian soldiers die. The ones that wake up go, we're getting out of here. And they flee. Okay. So that was a prediction that came true. And then it says, when she had weaned no pity, she conceived again and gave birth to another son. And then the Lord said, name him not my people, lo ami, because you are not my people and I am not your God. So we studied New Covenant terminology and went back to Leviticus 26. It said, God said, I will put my tabernacle in your midst and I will not abhor you. I will walk among you and I will be your God and you will be my people. Okay, that was the Sinai Mosaic covenant. Okay, that's the marriage covenant. That's the marriage language. And so this is marriage language, I think, for saying it's time for a divorce. Okay. So, but, or should I say, however, it says in the future, the number of the people of Israel will be like the sand of the sea that can be neither measured nor numbered. Although it was said to them, you are not my people, it will be said to them, you are children of the living God. Then the people of Judah and the people of Israel will be gathered together. They will appoint for themselves one leader and will flourish in the land. Certainly the day of Jezreel will be great. Then you will call your brother my people, and you will call your sister pity. So in this passage, we see a reference to the Abrahamic covenant. The people of Israel will be like the sand of the sea. You can't count them, right? Then we have, you are not my people. It will be said to them, you are children of the living God. So that's new covenant terminology. And Hosea is written a couple hundred years before Jeremiah and Ezekiel. And so, so there's a lot of parallels between Jeremiah and Hosea. And so Jeremiah borrowed stuff from Hosea, I think. They had the same author, basically, so he was just repeating it. Then it said that they will be gathered together in the land. James Hamilton says this phrase is go up from the land. And so he says that same phrase is used in the Exodus. And so this is the idea that this will be a new Exodus in the future. God will make a new covenant with them. Like we said, the new covenant terminology. So if you look at this section of future restoration, then you have numerical growth, the Abrahamic covenant, the spiritual restoration, the new covenant, national unification, administrative centralization, territorial occupation, and divine blessing. So we come to a point where we go, have these promises happened yet? Okay. And so we're back to our covenant theology dispensationalism discussion of last week. The dispensationalists would be going, no, they haven't. They're going to be happening in the millennium. The progressive covenantalism person would say, yes, these things have been fulfilled in Jesus. The land is really just the rest, our rest, okay? And he fulfills these promises, and by extension, the church. So, okay. Any questions so far? Y'all are not very inquisitive. Okay, so now we come to God's treatment for that adulterous wife, prostitute. And it's in chapter 2, verses 2 through 13. He says, plead earnestly with your mother, for she is not my wife, and I am not her husband, so that she might put an end to her adulterous lifestyle and turn away from her sexually immoral behavior. I'll come back to this slide in a minute and use the ESV. So this is divorce language, okay? It's not just a separation until they can work things out. Okay? And the goal is to force her to repent. And so he says in verse 3 and 4, otherwise I will strip her naked and expose her like she was when she was born. I will turn her land into a wilderness and make her country a parched land so that I might kill her with thirst. I will have no pity on her children because they are children conceived in adultery. So he's going to take away the rain and turn the land into a desert. He's going to kill her with thirst. Okay. I think this is the idea that, like the woman at the well in John 4, if you drink from this well, you're going to thirst again. But if you take the water that I give, you will not thirst. And so it's talking about meeting our deepest needs, knowing God again. Okay. Whatever Gomer's and Israel are striving after will not quench their thirst. Okay. They will not satisfy their deepest longings. In verse 5, it says, "For their mother has committed adultery. She who conceived them has acted shamefully. For she said, I will seek out my lovers. They are the ones who give me my bread and my water, my wool, my flax, my olive oil, and my wine." Okay. So she's out there pursuing what she thinks brings life. Okay. In verse 6 and 7, it says, "Therefore I will soon fence her in with thorns. I will wall her in so that she cannot find her way. Then she will pursue her lovers, but she will not catch them. She will seek them, but she will not find them. Then she will say, I will go back to my husband because I was better off then than I am now." Okay. So I think this is showing that our methods don't work. And it reveals that God is personally involved in making them not work. Okay. He's causing them to fail because he wants us to turn back to him. Okay. So in verse 8, "Yet until now she has refused to acknowledge that I was the one who gave her the grain, the new wine, and the olive oil, and that it was I who lavished on her the silver and gold that they used in worshiping Baal." Okay. So they did not recognize that God was the source of their blessing. Okay. They thought that Baal brought it to them. And they took the things that God had given them and then turned around and used them to worship Baal. So, in the same way, if God blesses us with a great job and extra money, we can turn around and take that and use it to buy more things, because we think that that's going to bring happiness. So, I'm going to go back to verse 2. ESV has, she put in the fourth line there, that she put away her whoring from her face. And the NIV, I think, has the adulterous look. Okay. And this, I told you, Hosea and Jeremiah are parallel in several places. And so I want to go over to Jeremiah and look at the parallel passage. And I'm seeing the parallel because of the adulterous look, the face of a whore, or the forehead of a whore. That is the language that they both use. So in Jeremiah 2:27, it says, "They say to a wooden idol, you are my father. They say to a stone image, you gave birth to me. Yes, they have turned away from me instead of turning to me. Yet when they are in trouble, they say, come and save us." Okay. So even when they're not following him, they're expecting him to rescue them or bless them. And he says, "But where are the gods you made for yourselves? Let them save you when you are in trouble." If a man divorces his wife and she leaves him and becomes another man's wife, he may not take her back again. That's what we talked about on. Don't you doing that would utterly defile the land, but you, Israel, have given yourself as a prostitute to many gods. So what makes you think you can return to me, says the Lord. And then it says, "Look up at the hilltops and consider this. Where have you not been ravished? You waited for those gods like a thief lying in wait in the wilderness. You defiled the land by your wicked prostitution to other gods. That is why the rains have been withheld and the spring rains have not come. Okay. So again, it's the parallel. It's bringing dryness to our lives. Okay. In verse 4, even though, but you refuse to be ashamed of what you have done. So, verse 4, even now you say to me, you are my father. You have been my faithful companion ever since I was young. You will not always be angry with me, will you? You will not be mad at me forever, will you? That is what you say, but you continually do all the evil that you can. So, when you look at both of these passages, the thing that I see in common, kind of an outline, is that it brings about, first of all, they didn't recognize God was the source of life. God brought about dryness in their lives to drive them back to Him. Their response was pride and not repentance. And they expected God to bless them, even though they were in rebellion. Okay. And then I think they basically were angry when He didn't do it. So I think the application that we could make to ourselves is, are we guilty of any of these things, right? Are we seeking after other things? They don't fulfill us. God causes our methods to fail. And does that drive us back to Him? Okay. So I'm going to give a personal example. When we lived in Germany, well, I'm going way back. We had plenty of money. I was an officer, had a good salary. We were pillars in the church. Lori ran the nursery stuff. I was a head of the deacons. We gave all that up and headed to Dallas Seminary. And in the process of moving, I got a hernia, and then I couldn't do carpentry work like I thought I would be able to. I couldn't even clean pools because I couldn't lift the buckets of stuff. I couldn't find a job. Our new baby had 12 ear infections, I think, the first year. And so we were running out of money. I found a job as a realtor, made a whole $11,000 that year because it was a depressed market. We had an awesome church in Germany because nobody had relatives within several thousand miles. And so we became family. And so we expected that kind of closeness when we came back here. And it just didn't work out. And we were broke. And so I've had the thought, do I really trust God? Because I don't need to. And then when we came to seminary, he made life a little drier, if you will. And I had grown up hearing mom and dad's stories. My dad went to Dallas Seminary, and somebody gave him a car. They got checks in the mail with just the exact amount of money they needed. My missionary aunts and uncles had the same kinds of experiences. And so I was expecting God to bless me. After all, look what I'm doing. I'm going to seminary, right? And so I thought God was being unfair. And I think, I was expecting Him to bless me. And I was just filling my head with knowledge, but I think He had to take me through this process to actually break me and realize what I had been depending on. And so, and I'm a slow learner, so He had to do it again in 94 because I was going to go to Moody Bible Institute and teach. And I was going to depend on selling Greek and Hebrew fonts to pay the bills because they weren't going to pay much. And we put a for sale by owner sign in the front yard. And the font stopped selling that day. And we got totally broke, couldn't pay the bills. I was having panic attacks. And I was listening to Larry Crabb explain Gomer. And I went, that's me. I'm depending on my own resources. And I just said, okay, God, I give up. I'm going to just sit here and scan in these stupid journals, and I'm just going to trust you. So we pulled the for sale by owner sign out of the yard. And the next day, the panic attack stopped. And over the next few weeks, I sold enough fonts to pay all the bills. And because I was here in Dallas and not in Spokane, my friend Joe and I started Bible.org and the Net Bible, and all that. And so, he was closing doors and working on my heart at the same time. So I find Gomer to be a good example of what we all can be guilty of. So anyway, any thoughts, any questions about Hosea so far? Okay. Well, thank you. We'll pick up in wherever we are next time.